they look similar to the aolids, especially down here. The digestive gland goes up into the serrata. They have the little areas where they store the nematocysts, and you're like, well, my goodness, how is that not an aolid? And it's because of the location of the anus is in a different spot. I mean, there are all sorts of slight variations that to the naked eye, things appear the same, but then if you look in a more microscopic, or not even microscopic, but just a more detail, scientists can then use those to categorize nudibranchs into different families based on slight anatomical differences. And these are other gastropods that you can see in shallow water or while scuba diving that some people will call a nudibranch because it looks sort of slug-like, but they're not technically nudibranchs. And again, this one down here looks a lot like a nudibranch, and it's only at a detailed level looking at its internal structures that makes it not a nudibranch. Some of them actually have shells inside of them, and if it has a shell, then it's not a nudibranch. But they're just other things that are out there that are part of, nudibranchs are part of a bigger family called Opisthabranchs, and these are part of that larger family, but they have features that make them different from nudibranchs. Now I'll talk a little bit about how big or how small nudibranchs are. We'll start out with the small one. So this is a millimeter. So this is 1 millimeter between 6 and 7, but it's 1 millimeter, and that's a grain of white rice and a wild rice. So you can see the size of that. And this is a nudibranch. It's a rustic aolid. They are common in the spring, but they're very small. Hard to see them because they look very similar to the area where they feed. This is the pink Tritonia again, and this is how big it is. That's my fin. This was on a dive. I apologize, I stirred up a little sand there. It's kind of grainy, but it's a really big nudibranch compared to the grain of rice nudibranch. This one's nice and big. I tripped over it when I was diving. It's nice to see the big ones sometimes after looking for the tiny ones. And so how do nudibranchs move? They move in a way that's similar to land slugs. They have a mucus. They produce a mucus, and they have cilia or hair-like processes that they use to glide on the mucus that their foot secretes. So very similar. And they do leave a slime trail, even underwater. There is a slime trail that these leave, just like slugs on land do. And another way that they can move is to actually swim. This is a giant nudibranch. This was in the Port Orchard Marina, so this was not on a dive. This was just at a dock. This was the surface of the water. The nudibranch was swimming.
How big is that?
This one's fairly big. This one's, what would you say? Yeah. Well, water makes things, yeah.
Maybe about this size.
Exactly. That's about right.
A couple of weeks ago about this.
Yeah, so about 4 inches or so.
Yeah, I like to go fishing.
Yeah, exactly. And then how do nudibranchs eat? Again, similar to land slugs. This is why land slugs can mow down your garden, because they, like the sea slug, the nudibranch, have this chitin. Chitin is it's a non-mineral substance that's hard, and it forms this structure called a radula, which is like a tongue. So they essentially have a file, like a nail file for a tongue, and they can just scrape through or cut through just about anything, especially soft things, which a lot of other foods that the nudibranchs eat are soft. Like anemones are soft, they have stinging cells, but they're soft, and so this does a fine job. Just like on the land slugs, they'll go through your tomatoes because the tomato can't stand up to this. This is a relative. It's a mollusk. It's not a nudibranch. It has a shell, so it's not a nudibranch. But I put this in because you can see it has a similar radula, and you can see the path that it scraped through the algae on this piling as it's moving along.
Please outline the animal. It's hard to see the outline.
You bet. This is the chitin. It's an animal that has plates. So these are the bony plates of it, but it's this right here. It's sort of a disc shape. And this is an opalescent nudibranch, which will eat anything. It's been grazing, it looks like, here and cleared quite a path with its radula. I'll talk a little bit about the nudibranch life cycle. Where do they come from? Just as everything, yes, the stork in the northwest brings nudibranchs, just like everywhere. The nudibranchs lay eggs. They lay up to 2 million eggs at a time. They're very small as eggs, and so they lay a lot of them because it's the only way they can really hope that any of them survive. So this shows a San Diego or leopard dorid laying eggs, and this shows 2 red sponge nudibranchs mating, having laid eggs already, but continuing to mate, and probably this one then will lay eggs because both there's not they're hermaphroditic. All nudibranchs have both reproductive organs, and so when they mate, they fertilize each other, and then both of the pair lay eggs. So they lay lots of eggs, but the eggs are very small, and they're free swimming, and they're eaten as eggs. So they need a lot of eggs in order to ensure that any survive to the next generation. And they have a fairly short lifespan. Some live as short as a month, and others maybe up to a year. But so reproduction is a big part of their lives. This is an image of the two primary forms of nudibranch development. There's direct development, meaning that the nudibranch lays eggs and it develops into a teeny tiny nudibranch. It hatches as a teeny tiny nudibranch, but that's a direct development. The other type is called indirect development, where there's eggs and they hatch as a free swimming veliger. They have a shell at this point. It's the only time in their life when they have a shell. And then once they find the food source that they're looking for by smell, they'll cast off the shell and metamorph into the juvenile nudibranch. And there is a third type that's not represented here, which is yolk bearing. So it goes through an intermediate stage from an egg to a form that has a yolk inside, and it lives on the yolk instead of this. This feeds on plankton, but there's another form that feeds on a yolk inside of the egg until it's turned into a juvenile, at which point it too lands on its food and starts life again. These are some magnified images of nudibranch veligers. You can see here that it does have a shell when it's at this stage. And this series shows once the veliger finds food and lands on it, it casts off its shell and is a teeny tiny nudibranch ready to eat and start the process over again.
What's it eating?
This looks like a hydroid, which is an animal. It's a colonial animal. I'll talk in just a minute about what they eat, but that looks to be a hydroid.
How long would that take?
For them to find, that's a good question. I'm not sure how long they spend as free-swimming villagers before they ultimately find their food, and I don't know that. That's a very good question. And then I'll talk now about what they eat. So these are hydroids. They look like plants. They look like ferns or something maybe, but they are animals. They're colonial animals. This one you cannot see it at all. And each one of these stalks is actually something that resembles this. There's like a ring of tentacles with stinging cells, and then a mouth and a tube that leads to the rest of the colony. And each one of them gathers food separately, but the food all goes down into a central colonial, somewhat of a root system, and the colony is fed from each of the individuals. This is a close-up of a very tiny hydroid, but you can see these are tentacles. You can almost see the little individual stinging cells on them. This is its mouth, that it will move its tentacles and move the food toward its mouth, and then that's the tube that then will connect up with the others and feed the colony, and it'll grow that way. These are bryozoans. They're also called moss animals because they look fuzzy, sort of like a moss, but they're not a plant. They are an animal. Again, it's a similar structure to a hydroid, and it's really hard to see with the naked eye. This fuzz, each one of these is a little teeny tiny horseshoe-shaped hairs that do funnel food down, and they are a colonial animal as well. They're just a little more complex than hydroids, and the differences are all at a microscopic level. You can't tell by looking at them sometimes whether they're one or the other. These are nudibranch eggs. That's one way to spot nudibranchs is to look for their eggs. That's usually easier to find than the nudibranch. These are other sources of food for nudibranchs. This is a sponge, and you can see a red sponge nudibranch on it. Right here, this is a tube-dwelling anemone, and this is a sea pen. And these all contain stinging cells for their own defense that nudibranchs use for their defense. The other thing, nudibranchs will take on the color of the food they eat, so you can tell to some extent what a nudibranch's been eating by what color it is. In this case, this white-lined dorona, this is its sort of normal coloration, a sort of translucent. And these are tunicates. It can eat the tunicates, or there's also maybe some brown bryozoan in here that it's been eating, but then it takes on the color of the food that it's been eating.